401 lawmakers voted yes. 17 voted no. That single vote gave Poland's border officers the right to use lethal force and immunity when they did. Since then, over 120,000 migrants have been pushed back and 55 have died. Poland's clash with Muslim migration isn't just escalating, it's now the law. And the real question is whether any of it was ever about safety. For years, Polish border agents relied on informal pushbacks, covertly turning migrants away from the Belarusian frontier without legal process. That approach operated in a grey zone, with deniability built in. But on July 12, 2024, the same removed ambiguity. The Homeland Defense Act passed by 401 votes to 17, granting the state's full backing to live force measures at the border. The law broadened the definition of who counts as an officer, now including soldiers, police, and border guard personnel, and authorized the use of firearms in 4 defined situations, from perceived threats to outright refusals to surrender weapons. Officers acting under these provisions received explicit exemption from criminal liability, a point that rights groups compared to a license to kill. The legislative debate was shaped by the death of a border guard 2 months earlier, which lawmakers cited as evidence of a new, dangerous reality. In this climate, the act passed with near unanimity, reflecting a broad consensus that border enforcement should be uncompromising and shielded from legal consequence. A further step came in February 2025, when Bill 924 allowed the government to suspend asylum applications for up to 60 days in areas facing so-called instrumentalized migration. In these designated zones, border guards could refuse claims outright and order immediate expulsions, with only narrow exceptions for vulnerable groups. The result? Refusal, rapid expulsion, and the bypassing of individual assessment are no longer exceptional. They are now woven into the legal fabric of Poland's border regime. The border between Poland and Belarus has become the center of a new kind of confrontation, one where migration is used as a weapon. Belarus, under President Alexander Lukashenko, opened its gates to travelers from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and parts of Africa, offering so-called visa-free packages in Minsk. Travel agencies and airlines sold tickets that promised not just a trip, but a guided route to the European Union's edge. Fees ranged from 1,500 to 15,000 euros, covering flights, paperwork, and even transport to the Polish fence. Once there, migrants found themselves at the front line of a geopolitical standoff, their journeys manipulated to pressure the EU. In September 2021, Poland declared a state of emergency along the border. Construction crews broke ground on a 5.5-meter steel fence stretching 186 kilometers, reinforced with cameras and motion detectors. The barrier was more than just a physical obstacle. It was a signal of a hardened posture. A 3-kilometer wide border guard zone was established, later tightened with buffer zone restrictions. Entry into this strip was tightly controlled, and any presence without authorization risked immediate expulsion. This stretch of land transformed from a quiet rural crossing into a fortified fault line. Belarus functioned as the external pressure point, Poland as the state forced to react. Here, the border is no longer just a line on a map, but a battlefield shaped by political calculation and the movement of desperate people. Political leaders from both sides of Poland's divide have closed ranks on border enforcement. During the Law and Justice years, Beata Szydło, Mateusz Morawiecki, and Jarosław Kaczyński treated border toughness not as a temporary measure, but as a core principle of national defense. Their rhetoric, repeated in parliament and the press, defined migration from Belarus as a threat to sovereignty and public order. In this climate, Dominik Tarczyński became the loudest voice, warning migrants in a viral interview, "You will be killed," if they tried to cross. His blunt message, amplified on social media, captured the mood of a government ready to use force. When Donald Tusk took over, many expected a softer approach. Instead, the security-first framing stayed in place. Tusk's administration kept the core language of sovereignty and national defense, defending the new laws as essential to protect the country from what he called a hybrid war. The parliamentary votes on the Homeland Defense Act and Bill 924 showed broad support, with only a handful of dissenters. Both PS and Civic Coalition deputies backed the measures, making border hardening a shared electoral asset rather than a partisan wedge. The border's transformation from a local concern to a symbol of state resolve is now anchored in the political mainstream. The faces change, but the message remains. The line with Belarus is not just a boundary, but a test of Poland's will to defend itself, no matter who is in charge. Polish leaders have long pointed to the country's safety record as proof that strict border measures work. Official statistics show Poland's intentional homicide rate at 1.2 per 100,000, well below the EU average of 1.7. Government spokespeople often cite these numbers, presenting Poland as one of Europe's safest countries. Yet the story behind these figures is more complicated than a simple cause and effect. On the terrorism front, Poland's standing in the Global Terrorism Index is 85 out of 135, placing it in the lower half worldwide. Europol's 2024 TESAT report found 0 terrorist attacks in Poland directly linked to migrant perpetrators. Although the number of radicalization investigations has grown, from 4 cases in 2022 to 7 in 2024, there is no evidence connecting these inquiries to the border crackdown or to recent arrivals from Muslim-majority countries. The asylum data tells a similar story. In 2021, Poland registered a peak of 13,570 first-time asylum applicants, but that number has since dropped sharply, falling to just 850 in early 2025. Of the 2021 applicants, about 12% were Muslims, mainly from Syria and Afghanistan. Even at its highest, Poland's Muslim population remains tiny compared to the EU average, with estimates hovering around 0.12% of the population versus roughly 5% across the bloc. Supporters of the new laws argue that Poland's low crime and terror rates are the result of hardline enforcement. But the trend lines suggest that the country was already among the safest in Europe before the latest crackdowns. The data raises a question. Does the border regime protect Poland, or does it simply follow from a demographic reality that has long set the country apart from its neighbours? The answer depends on how one interprets the numbers and what is left out of the official story. Poland's border laws now face a direct legal challenge from the European Union. Under the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol, Poland is required to hear each asylum claim individually and to avoid sending people back to places where they may face persecution. The European Convention on Human Rights adds protections against collective expulsion and inhuman treatment. In 2022, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in MK and Others versus Poland that systematic pushbacks at the Belarus border violated these obligations. The UN Human Rights Committee reached a similar conclusion in AB and BD versus Poland. Despite these rulings, new legislation has hardened the border even further. The European Commission responded by opening an infringement procedure in December 2024, sending Poland a formal notice that its asylum suspension law may breach EU rules. By March 2025, the Commission issued a reasoned opinion, warning that continued non-compliance could lead to referral to the Court of Justice of the EU and daily fines. Poland's government invokes Article 72 of the EU treaties, citing sovereignty and public order exceptions. But the EU maintains that emergency cannot override core rights. The legal dispute now stands as a test of how far a state can go in the name of security before it collides with European law. The impact of Poland's border policy is measured in lives uprooted and journeys cut short. Since the legal overhaul, more than 120,000 pushbacks have been recorded at the Belarusian border. Humanitarian monitors have confirmed at least 55 deaths. Men, women, and children lost to exposure, hypothermia, or untreated illness in the forests and marshes between two states. The Al-Haddad family, fleeing violence in Aleppo, reached the Terespol crossing in February 2025. Polish guards intercepted them, denied their claim, and forced them back across the line. Within hours, Belarusian authorities repatriated them to Syria. The Rahimi family from Afghanistan faced a similar fate after a failed attempt in April, turned away under the 60-day suspension, detained in Belarus, then returned to Kabul. In 2025 alone, over 2,100 people were deported from Poland, twice the figure from the previous year. With each new restriction, migrants turned to more dangerous routes, exposing themselves to traffickers and further risk. As Poland's approach hardens, the question lingers: will other European countries follow, or is this frontier an outlier in a continent searching for answers? As Poland cements its border with new laws, Europe watches. Hardline tactics once seen as exceptional now set precedent across the continent. The line between security and exclusion has rarely been thinner or more contested. What happens here may soon shape the fate of borders everywhere. Share your perspective below.